Dopamine affects motivation. Adrenaline can raise blood pressure. Chronic stress can influence cardiovascular health. All three statements are true, and that is exactly how a false mechanism becomes convincing. Take three documented facts, connect them in the wrong order, and suddenly the internet has created a biological chain the human body has never been shown to follow. So in this chapter, we are going to separate two systems that are constantly confused: the cardiovascular stress chain and the behavioral reward chain, where dopamine actually belongs, where adrenaline belongs, and the precise point where behavior can change the conditions shaping cardiovascular health. Without inventing a mechanism the evidence cannot support. Before the chain can be followed, two neurochemical systems need to be understood clearly. The first is dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger produced in specific regions of the brain and released between neurons to carry signals. It is most commonly called the pleasure chemical. That description is incomplete. Dopamine participates in reward prediction, motivation, learning, incentive salience, the process through which something becomes important enough for the brain to pursue, and the allocation of effort toward a potential reward. It is deeply involved in motivated behavior. But dopamine is not a reservoir of willpower. It is not a tank that fills when a man abstains and empties when he ejaculates. The brain regulates dopamine through multiple pathways, receptors, feedback systems, and circuits. That complexity matters, because the moment dopamine is described as a finite fuel, an entire false chain becomes easy to build. And this series does not build chains the evidence cannot support. The second is noradrenaline, also called norepinephrine. Noradrenaline functions as a neurotransmitter in the brain and as a chemical signal in the peripheral nervous system. In the brain, it is involved in arousal, vigilance, and attention. In the peripheral nervous system, noradrenaline is one of the major chemical messengers released by sympathetic nerve terminals. It acts on receptors in the heart and blood vessels. Adrenaline, also called epinephrine, is closely related, but the two are not identical. Their receptor effects differ, their sources differ, and their cardiovascular actions overlap without being interchangeable. What matters for this series is the larger principle. The sympathetic nervous system and catecholamine signaling are deeply involved in acute cardiovascular regulation. When the stress system is recruited, catecholamines are released. Heart rate, cardiac force, and vascular tone can change, and blood pressure can rise. That is the documented acute pathway. Now, chain 1, the cardiovascular stress chain, the one this entire series has been building. A significant challenge or stressor arrives. The brain's stress appraisal systems respond. The sympathetic nervous system is recruited. Noradrenaline is released at sympathetic nerve terminals. Adrenal catecholamines can enter the circulation. The heart can change its rate and force. Vascular tone changes. Blood pressure can rise. Then the stressor recedes. The immediate demand passes. The system moves toward recovery. Blood pressure returns toward baseline. This is the acute chain. Designed, functional, documented. Now, what happens when the stressor does not clearly resolve? When the demands of modern life repeatedly recruit the system across days, months, and years. Repeated stress does not mean one molecule remains in the blood forever. It means the system is recruited again, and again, and again. And in some people, over months and years, alongside genetics, kidney function, metabolic health, sleep, diet, and vascular change. Repeated sympathetic activation may become one part of the larger physiology, contributing to sustained higher pressure. This is the chain this series has been tracing since Chapter 1. It is documented. It is multifactorial. It is not a single cause. It is one important thread in a network. Now, Chain 2, the behavioral reward chain. This is where dopamine belongs. A cue appears, something the brain has learned to associate with reward. Anticipation rises. Dopamine-related salience increases. The cue becomes compelling, worth pursuing, worth effort. The behavior is pursued. Reward arrives. Dopamine participates in the learning that follows, strengthening the association between the cue, the pursuit, and the reward. The behavior becomes easier to repeat. The cue becomes more reliably attention-capturing. This is not automatically addiction. This is learning. This is how the brain allocates motivated behavior across every domain of a man's life. But in some people, with some behaviors, this chain can become difficult to control. The behavior is repeated more often than intended. The cue becomes harder to ignore. The behavior is used not primarily for pleasure, but to manage an internal state, anxiety, boredom, loneliness, stress. The behavior persists despite negative consequences. When a behavioral pattern reaches that threshold, the health consequences may begin to emerge, not necessarily through a direct physiological chain from the behavior itself, through the conditions the behavior creates. Here is how the two chains can come into contact. A compulsive behavior can repeatedly displace sleep. Short or disrupted sleep is associated with higher cardiovascular risk and can adversely affect blood pressure regulation. A behavior experienced as difficult to control, especially when it produces significant distress, functional impairment, relationship conflict, or repeated unwanted consequences, can become part of a man's chronic stress load. Chronic stressors repeatedly recruit the cardiovascular stress chain. A behavior that damages a primary relationship can transform that relationship into one of the largest sources of chronic stress in a man's life. A behavior that keeps a man sedentary and isolated at night can displace the movement and social connection that support cardiovascular health. And a man who uses sexual stimulation as his primary method of regulating emotional discomfort, who has never developed other ways to manage the internal states he is avoiding, may be relying on one behavior as his primary method of managing emotional discomfort. That pattern can interact with his stress, his sleep, his relationships, and the wider conditions shaping his health. The connection is not ejaculation-drained dopamine and raised cortisol. The connection is behavior changes conditions. Conditions shape physiology. Physiology influences cardiovascular risk. That is the chain. Simpler than 14 links, more defensible, and actually more useful, because it points directly toward what a man can change. You do not need to invent a biological mechanism to take a repeated behavior seriously. If a behavior is displacing sleep, address it. If it is increasing distress, address it. If it is damaging a relationship that has become one of the largest sources of stress in your life, address it. If you repeatedly use stimulation to escape an internal state you have never learned to regulate, address it. Not because ejaculation has been proven to cause hypertension. It has not. Because behavior creates conditions, and conditions are what systems repeatedly adapt to. That is the connection this series is built around, not a hidden chain that medicine missed. A simpler principle supported across behavioral and physiological research. Repeated behavior changes the conditions in which a man lives, and repeated conditions can shape health over time. The nervous system responds to repeated inputs. The cardiovascular system responds to repeated physiological conditions. And the man who wants to understand his pressure, who wants to work on every relevant condition rather than just manage the number, has to become willing to examine the conditions he repeatedly creates. All of them. Chapter 7. The vagus nerve turns toward one of the most discussed pathways in autonomic health. What it actually does, what it does not do, whether it can really be activated on command, and why the vagus nerve is both more important and more misunderstood than most men realize. This is the silent current. Chapter 6, complete. Your body has been trying to tell you something. It is time to listen.